Hello and welcome to this webinar entitled Executing Documents Using Electronic Signatures, Guidance, Legislation and Case Law with me, Keith Markham. As always, let's begin by having a look at the agenda for this session today, which is rather extensive. So we're going to begin by looking at kind of an overview. We'll refer particularly to a report produced by the Law Commission pre-pandemic, which still is very much the classic summary of the law as it stands today, and we'll see that that has then been taken on by a further organisation or a further group called the Industry Working Group, which has then set out some more practical proposals that we'll come to a little bit later on. We'll then go on to talk about applicable legislation. So there are two sets of legislation here, really. We've got the Electronic Communications Act, and then we've got the EIDAS regulation, and the latter of those sets out detail with regard to three types of electronic signature. We'll obviously go through what those three types are and also discuss the likelihood of you using them in practice. After that, we'll look at sort of a broader examination of types of electronic signature. We will see that there are certain specific types set out in legislation, but we'll also see that our courts have taken a very pragmatic approach in terms of what constitutes an electronic signature. And on the back of that, we will look at a couple of cases that show the approach that the courts have taken to do with contracts for guarantee, for example, and also contracts for the sale of land. After that, we'll then go on to discuss issues relating to deeds, and we'll see that there are a variety of matters there in terms of witnessing, for example, the format that has to take, whether we can electronically sign a deed or not. We'll also see that there is some useful guidance from the land registry about the execution of deeds to do with land, and that will lead us, in fact, into an examination as to how all of this works in the context of property transactions. We'll see that, obviously, post-pandemic, we're now in a slightly different world in terms of the land registry being more receptive to the use of electronic signatures, and we'll see what sort of procedures they have set out with regard to that. Then we'll look at wills, and you may be aware that during the pandemic there were certain alterations to the rules about witnessing of wills and so on, and we'll look at an update as to whether that's continuing or not. And then finally, we will look at a bit of a risk assessment in terms of what types of electronic signature pose a greater risk and which ones pose a lesser risk, and we'll also look briefly at potential future developments in this area of the law.